The US TV host Tucker Carlson set off a political scandal by traveling to Moscow to interview the Russian president Vladimir Putin. And this has led to a big debate in the US media, which, as usual, when we're talking about partisan US politics, completely misses the forest for the trees. Now, there are a lot of liberal war hawks in the Democratic Party who portrayed Tucker Carlson as a traitor for interviewing Vladimir Putin. And this is part of this liberal obsession with Russia in the US, which completely fails to understand what's happening politically. What's actually happening is that Tucker Carlson and his right-wing allies in the Republican Party, including Donald Trump, and Tucker is very close to Donald Trump, what they have been trying to do for years is to try to drive a wedge in between Russia and China, and they have been trying to push for war on China.
Russia is not America's main enemy, obviously. No sane person thinks it is. Our main enemy, of course, is China. And the United States ought to be in a relationship with Russia aligned against China.
So the idea that Tucker Carlson is anti-war is ridiculous. Tucker Carlson constantly publishes war propaganda against China.
The biggest threat to this country is not Vladimir Putin. That's ludicrous. The biggest threat, obviously, is China.
And the narrative that he has been pushing for years, back when Tucker Carlson was on Fox News, and since he was fired from Fox News, the narrative that he's been pushing again and again and again is that the US should ally with Russia against China. The reason that he says that he's against war on Russia is because in reality, he wants war on China.
If Russia ever joined forces with China, American global hegemony, its power would end instantly.
Tucker has said this again and again and again.
If Russia and China ever got together, it would be a brand new world, and the United States would be greatly diminished. Most Americans agree that would be bad.
However, Vladimir Putin is smart enough to know that Tucker Carlson is a political operative acting on behalf of the Republican Party and Donald Trump, and that Tucker is trying to encourage division between Russia and its most important ally, China. So Putin pushed back against Tucker Carlson's warmongering anti-China propaganda in this interview that he did. Tucker claimed that China is going to be a new imperial power, supposedly, and Tucker claimed that China is supposedly threatening other countries in the BRICS alliance and is violating their sovereignty, and Putin pushed back against this nonsense. And Putin said that this is a boogeyman narrative, and Putin emphasized that China wants peaceful cooperation and that China's foreign policy is not aggressive.
The question is what comes next, and maybe you trade one colonial power for another, much less sentimental and forgiving colonial power. I mean, is the BRICS, for example, in danger of being completely dominated by the Chinese economy in a way that's not good for their sovereignty? Do you worry about that?
Well, we have heard those boogeyman stories before. It is a boogeyman story. We're neighbors with China. You cannot choose neighbors just as you cannot choose close relatives. We share a border of 1,000 kilometers with them. This is number one. Second, we have a centuries-long history of coexistence. We're used to it. Third, China's foreign policy philosophy is not aggressive. Its idea is to always look for compromise, and we can see that. The next point is as follows. We are always told the same boogeyman story, and here it goes again. Through an euphemistic form, but it is still the same boogeyman story. The cooperation with China keeps increasing. The pace at which China's cooperation with Europe is growing is higher and greater than that of the growth of Chinese-Russian cooperation. Ask Europeans, aren't they afraid? They might be, I don't know. But they are still trying to access China's market at all costs, especially now that they are facing economic problems. Chinese businesses are also exploring the European market. Do Chinese businesses have small presence in the United States? Yes, the political decisions are such that they are trying to limit their cooperation with China. It is to your own detriment, Mr. Tucker, that you are limiting cooperation with China. You are hurting yourself.
As that clip shows, Russia can clearly see that this is a strategy that is trying to isolate China and trying to divide the BRICS. Putin is too smart to fall for this, but we can clearly see this is the US strategy. Now, the irony is that the Western hysteria over Russiagate, this nonsense liberal conspiracy theory, actually prevented the far-right Trumpist elements, and also in Europe, people like Marine Le Pen, it prevented them from realizing this strategy of allying with Russia against China, and it basically guaranteed that at least in the medium term, for years to come, Russia and China are very closely allied, and that is going to prevent the US in many ways from trying to divide the BRICS. Now that's why the US is instead focusing on India and trying to divide India and China in order to try to weaken China. But you cannot understand the geopolitics of the situation with this nonsensical Russiagate narrative that Trump and Tucker Carlson are Putin puppets. They're not. They want war on China. And Steve Bannon, who was previously the top advisor for Donald Trump, and he ran Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. Steve Bannon has said for years, quote, "We are at war with China," blatantly. He says it openly. We are waging war on China. This is the strategy of the Republican Party, of Tucker Carlson, of Donald Trump. They're not anti-war. They only oppose war on Russia because they see Russia as Christian and white and capitalist, and they want to ally with Russia against China, which they see as Asiatic and non-white and communist and atheist. So they see China as an existential threat to so-called Western civilization, and that's why they want to ally with Russia. And since getting fired from Fox News, Tucker Carlson has repeatedly churned out this ridiculous anti-China propaganda, claiming, for instance, that China is fueling an invasion of America. And if you actually believe that, then the solution is war. He's calling for war on China because he's claiming that China is invading the US. Tucker has also done ridiculous interviews with Donald Trump in which they claim that China is an imperialist power taking over so-called our hemisphere, claiming that the US controls the Western hemisphere. Here's a clip of that.
Why is China allowed to conduct imperialism in our hemisphere?
Well, yeah, and it's far beyond Cuba. It's all over South America.
Yeah, the Caribbean.
China's building military installations in Cuba. The Cuban population of Miami is not too happy because they're never going to be able to go back. And installations means military installations. Okay, you know, there's just some communication. They did that on the islands with Japan.
So this is the ridiculous warmongering propaganda that Tucker and Donald Trump are promoting together, claiming that China is conducting imperialism, and completely falsely, they're claiming that China is building military bases in Cuba. Completely false. But once again, this is the warmongering anti-China propaganda that Tucker Carlson has continued doing since getting fired from Fox News. It wasn't just when he was at Fox. Now, it's important to recognize that Tucker Carlson is not only a close personal friend of Donald Trump, he is a political ally and a propagandist on behalf of Trump and Trump's faction of the Republican Party. Tucker Carlson is a spokesman for this faction of the U.S. ruling class, the imperialists who are trying to get control over the government again. And Donald Trump has repeatedly said that he has considered Tucker Carlson to be vice president of the U.S. government, of the U.S. empire. And it is very possible that Trump will win the presidential election. Most polls show that he is leading over Joe Biden. And Trump has already been saying publicly that he wants to wage a new trade war against China. In fact, the Washington Post reported that Trump wants to put 60% tariffs on all imports of Chinese goods into the US. And then Trump was asked about this in an interview on Fox News, and he said that he wants to impose even higher tariffs than 60%. This would be an extreme escalation of the trade war that Trump started in his first term, and historically, when we look at economic wars like this, they tend to lead to military conflicts, to conventional wars. So Trump's extremely hawkish anti-China policies could very well escalate into a full-on war. And that is why many of these right-wing pundits like Tucker Carlson are manufacturing consent for war on China. They are preparing to justify a war with China. In addition to being a close ally of Donald Trump, Tucker has also been promoting the Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, and he brought on Vivek to talk about why China is a so-called threat, and in particular to warmonger against China over Taiwan. And Vivek Ramaswamy's entire proposed foreign policy is based on this idea that Tucker Carlson shares, that the US should try to ally with Russia against China in order to wage war on China. In fact, it's not just the Republicans in the US. The far right in Europe says the exact same thing. So Marine Le Pen in France, from the far right movement in France, she has said that Europe should ally with Russia against China in order to prevent an alliance between Russia and China, because they all see China as a threat to so-called Western civilization. They hate China for being socialist, for being atheist, for being non-white, because they are all neo-colonialists and white supremacists and capitalists, and they see the capitalist Christian West, white West, as the force that should control the entire world. They are neo-colonialists, and that's why they're so afraid of China.